In the year 28 AD, a rabbi from Nazareth walked into a synagogue in Galilee on the Sabbath, looked straight at a man with a withered hand, and healed him in front of everyone. The Pharisees had been watching, waiting to catch him in the act. And when it happened, they didn't ask questions. They walked out and started planning how to kill him. That was just the first time. The Gospels record at least 7 occasions where Jesus healed specifically on the Sabbath, the holiest day in Judaism, the one day you were never supposed to work. And every single time he did it publicly, deliberately, knowing exactly what it would cost him. So why did he keep doing it? Why choose the one day guaranteed to get him killed? The answer changes everything you think you know about why Jesus died. If you'd asked anyone in Judea about the Sabbath in the years before Jesus was born, they wouldn't have described it the way we tend to imagine it. We picture something like a gentle Sunday morning, a day off, a spiritual breather, maybe a nice meal with family and then a nap, something pleasant, something optional, something with soft edges. That's not what the Sabbath was. And if you don't understand what it actually meant, everything Jesus did on that day looks like a misunderstanding instead of what it really was, which was the most deliberate, most provocative, most theologically loaded act of his entire public ministry. For a Jewish person living in the 1st century under Roman occupation, the Sabbath was the defining marker of who they were as a people. It wasn't just a practice, it was identity. In the book of Exodus, chapter 31, God tells Moses that the Sabbath is a sign between him and the people of Israel forever. The Hebrew word used there is ot. It means a signal, a distinguishing mark, a brand burned into the very soul of a nation. Violating the Sabbath wasn't like skipping church. It was like renouncing your citizenship in the kingdom of God. And to understand why that weight was so extreme, you need to know the history that came before. During the roughly 400 years between the last book of the Old Testament and the first events of the New, the Jewish people were conquered, exiled, scattered, occupied, and oppressed by a succession of empires. First, the Babylonians destroyed the temple and dragged the people to Mesopotamia. Then the Persians allowed some to return. Then the Greeks swept through under Alexander the Great, and after his death, his successors fought over the region like wolves, tearing at a carcass. One of those successors, a man named Antiochus Epiphanes, decided that the best way to unify his territory was to eliminate Jewish distinctiveness altogether. He banned Sabbath observance. He banned circumcision. He erected a statue of Zeus inside the temple in Jerusalem and sacrificed a pig on the altar. He ordered Torah scrolls burned in public squares. And he executed Jewish mothers who circumcised their infant sons, hanging the dead babies around their mothers' necks as a warning to others. The revolt that followed, led by a family called the Maccabees, was fought specifically to preserve the right to keep the Torah, to keep the Sabbath, to remain Jewish. It lasted years. It cost thousands of lives. And it worked for a while until Rome arrived and imposed its own kind of control. So by the time Jesus walks into that synagogue in Galilee, somewhere around the year 28 or 29 AD, the Sabbath isn't just a religious observance. It's a scar. It's a wound that healed but never stopped aching. It's the thing their great-grandparents bled for, the thing that makes them who they are. And anyone who touches it, anyone who treats it casually, anyone who appears to disregard it, is poking at the deepest nerve in the national psyche. That's the world into which the rabbinical tradition built what scholars call the fence around the Torah. The idea was simple, at least in principle. God said, "Don't work on the Sabbath." Fine. But what counts as work? If you can't carry a burden, does that include your sandals? If you can't light a fire, can you keep one burning that was started before sundown? If a fly lands on your parchment while you're writing, is swatting it away an act of labor? These aren't jokes. These were real debates, argued with total sincerity by some of the finest legal minds in the ancient world. And the consensus they reached was recorded in the Mishnah, the written collection of oral traditions compiled around 200 AD, but based on rulings and practices that were well established long before Jesus was born. The rabbis identified 39 categories of forbidden labor, drawn from the types of work used to build the tabernacle in the wilderness: sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves, threshing, winnowing, sorting, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, shearing wool, bleaching, combing, dyeing, spinning, weaving, tying a knot, untying a knot, sewing 2 stitches, tearing, trapping an animal, slaughtering, skinning, tanning, scraping hide, cutting, writing 2 letters, erasing, building, demolishing, extinguishing a fire, kindling a fire, the final blow of the hammer, and carrying an object from one domain to another. 39 categories, each with subcategories and subcategories of subcategories. An entire universe of legal precision built to ensure that no one accidentally crossed the line. And they weren't doing this to be petty. I want to be clear about that, because it's easy to caricature the Pharisees as small-minded bureaucrats obsessed with rules for the sake of rules. That's not what was happening. They were doing this because they believed, with every fiber of their being, that God had given them a command, and that national obedience to that command was the only thing standing between Israel and total destruction. They had the receipts. They'd seen what happened when the covenant was broken: the exile, the desecration of the temple, the persecution, the death. So the fence wasn't cruelty. It was fear wrapped in devotion. And healing fell into a careful grey area. The rabbinical principle of pikuach nefesh, the preservation of life, allowed and even required breaking the Sabbath if someone was in mortal danger. If a wall collapsed on someone, you could dig them out. If a woman was in active labor, a midwife could assist. If someone was choking, you could intervene. Life overrode the Sabbath, but chronic conditions were different. If someone had been sick for years, if they had a withered hand or a bent back or blindness from birth, then by definition their condition was stable. They weren't going to die today. And if they weren't going to die today, the healing could wait until after sundown, when the Sabbath ended. You weren't being heartless. You were being faithful. You were protecting the covenant. At least, that's how the system worked. And this is where Jesus walks in and sets the entire structure on fire. The Gospels record at least 7 distinct occasions where Jesus specifically heals someone on the Sabbath. And the pattern, the way he does it each time, is so consistent and so deliberately public that it's impossible to read these as accidents. He never healed secretly on the Sabbath. Every single time, it was visible, it was confrontational, and it was designed to force a question that nobody in the room could avoid. But what happened in that synagogue in Galilee is the one that changed everything. Mark chapter 3 opens with Jesus entering the synagogue on the Sabbath. There's a man present with a shriveled, useless hand, and Mark writes in plain and devastating language that some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. This wasn't a spontaneous encounter. The Pharisees had positioned themselves in that room. They had likely ensured this man would be visible, placed in Jesus's line of sight, arranged like evidence in a courtroom. The trap was set. The witnesses were in place. All they needed was for Jesus to take the bait. And he knew, He always knew. So what does he do? He doesn't pretend the man isn't there. He doesn't wait until after the service and heal him privately in the alley behind the building. He calls the man forward, into the center of the room, in front of everyone, under every watching eye. And then Jesus turns to the Pharisees, the men who set this trap, and asks a question that cuts straight through centuries of legal scaffolding to the beating heart underneath. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it? Silence, complete silence, because there's no safe answer. If they say, do good, then the healing is justified and their accusation collapses. If they say, do evil, they condemn themselves in front of the entire congregation. So they say nothing. And Mark describes what happens next with one of the most emotionally raw phrases anywhere in the New Testament. Jesus looks around at them with anger, deeply grieved at their hardness of heart. Both emotions at once, fury and sorrow. He's not annoyed, he's devastated, and furious about what made him devastated. Then he says, "Stretch out your hand." The man does, and it's completely restored. And Mark records what happens immediately after, a verse that should stop every reader cold. The Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Chapter 3. Early in the story. And the first murder conspiracy is already underway, not because of a political speech or a theological claim in the abstract, but because of a single healing on the Sabbath. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. Jesus didn't stop. He didn't back down. If anything, the Sabbath healings accelerated, and each one pushed the confrontation further into dangerous territory. In Luke chapter 13, there's a woman who's been bent over, unable to stand up straight, for 18 years. The text says she was crippled by a spirit, bound by something beyond the physical. For 18 years, the only thing she'd seen clearly was the ground beneath her feet. She didn't come to the synagogue that day looking for a miracle. She came because it was the Sabbath, because that's what faithful Jewish women did. She came to worship. And Jesus sees her, not in the abstract, not as a theological opportunity. He sees her, he calls her over and places his hands on her and says, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." And immediately, after 18 years of staring at the dirt, she stands up straight. Imagine that moment inside the stone walls of a first-century synagogue. The first time in nearly 2 decades that she lifts her eyes and sees the ceiling, the faces of people around her, the sky through the doorway. 18 years of seeing nothing but dust and sandals and her own shadow, and suddenly the world opens up above her. She begins praising God right there in the room, and the synagogue leader is indignant. But look at who he confronts. He doesn't challenge Jesus directly. He turns to the crowd and says, with the tone of a man reciting a regulation, "There are 6 days for work. So come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath." Come and be healed on those days. As if healing were an appointment you could schedule, as if wholeness should wait in line behind the calendar. And Jesus' response is the kind of sentence that lands like a hammer and echoes for centuries. He calls the leader a hypocrite, right there in front of the entire congregation. Then he says, "Doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or your donkey from the stall and lead it to water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her?" A daughter of Abraham. He's using covenant language deliberately. He's saying this woman, this specific overlooked, bent-over woman standing in the back of the room, has more right to freedom on the Sabbath than your livestock does. And if the Sabbath is a day of rest, a day of wholeness, a day of liberation, then this is exactly the right day to break every chain. Luke tells us that all his opponents were humiliated, and the entire crowd was delighted by the wonderful things he was doing. This is where things get really interesting, because the next Sabbath healing takes the confrontation out of the synagogue and into the dining room. Luke chapter 14. Jesus has been invited to eat at the house of a prominent Pharisee on the Sabbath, and Luke adds a line that mirrors the synagogue scene almost exactly. He was being carefully watched. The dinner is a setup. A man with dropsy, a condition that causes severe swelling in the limbs and the abdomen, is present at the table, and Jesus, fully aware of the surveillance, turns to the lawyers and Pharisees and asks point-blank, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" They say nothing. Again. So Jesus takes hold of the man, heals him, and sends him on his way. Then he asks the room, "If one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out?" And again, they have nothing to say, because the answer is obvious. Of course they would pull the child out. Of course they would rescue the ox. But somehow, healing a man whose body is swollen with fluid, that's supposed to wait until tomorrow. Now we come to the pool of Bethesda in John chapter 5. And this is the healing that didn't just break the rules. It rewrote the entire conversation about who Jesus claimed to be. The pool of Bethesda sat near the sheep gate in the old city of Jerusalem, surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Archaeologists have actually excavated this site, confirming the pool's existence and its unusual dual basin structure beneath the streets of the modern city. In the 1st century, these porticos were crowded with disabled people, blind, lame, paralyzed, withered. They lay on mats and pallets, waiting. Tradition held that an angel would occasionally come down and stir the water, and whoever got into the pool first after the stirring would be healed. Whether you take that literally or as a folk belief doesn't change the scene. These were desperate people, clinging to desperate hope day after day, year after year. One man had been lying there for 38 years. That's not a number that should slide past you. That's longer than many of us have been alive. He'd been in that same spot by the water, on that same mat, watching the same Jerusalem sky, while emperors rose and fell, and children grew into grandparents. Jesus walks up to this man, out of all the dozens or hundreds lying around that pool, and asks a question that sounds almost cruel on the surface. "Do you want to get well?" And the man doesn't answer yes. He explains why he can't. "Sir, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." He's been so shaped by his limitation, so defined by 38 years of waiting and failing, that he can't even imagine being asked whether he wants something different. He's forgotten how to want, and Jesus simply says, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." The man does. Instantly, muscles that hadn't worked in decades fire to life. Legs that had been useless since the reign of a forgotten emperor bear weight. He stands, he bends down. He picks up the mat he'd been lying on for longer than most careers last, and he walks away from the pool of Bethesda. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything that followed. The Jewish leaders in the temple courts see the man carrying his mat and stop him. It's the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat. And they're technically correct. Carrying an object from one domain to another was one of the 39 forbidden categories of labor. The man has been healed after 38 years, and the first thing the authorities notice is the mat. He tells them, "The man who made me well told me to pick up my mat and walk." They want to know who told him to do this. The man doesn't even know Jesus' name. He'd been healed by a stranger who had already slipped away into the Jerusalem crowd. But later, Jesus finds him in the temple courts, tells him he's been made well, and warns him to stop sinning so something worse doesn't happen. The man goes and tells the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who healed him. And then comes the verse that detonates the entire story. John chapter 5, verse 16. So, because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. But Jesus doesn't apologize. He doesn't soften his position. He doesn't offer a compromise. He escalates. He says something that, in the theological context of first-century Judaism, lands with the force of a thunderclap inside the temple. "My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working." If you're hearing that in English in the 21st century, it might sound like a reasonable theological statement. A nice point about God's ongoing involvement in the world. But in that room, in that language, in that culture, those words were a death sentence. In Jewish theology, God doesn't observe the Sabbath the way humans do. The rabbis themselves acknowledged this and debated it extensively. God continues to sustain the universe every single day, including the Sabbath. The sun rises on the seventh day, rain falls, hearts beat, babies are born, people die. Creation doesn't pause. God's providential work, his life-giving, sustaining, governing activity, continues without interruption. But here's the critical point. That ongoing divine work was understood as uniquely, exclusively, irreducibly God's own prerogative. It was the one exception to Sabbath rest, and it belonged to God alone. No human being could claim that exception. No rabbi could say, "I'm doing God's kind of work on the Sabbath, so I'm exempt." That would be blasphemy of the highest order. So when Jesus says, "My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working," he isn't comparing himself to a dutiful son helping around the house. He's placing himself in the same operational category as the creator of the universe. He's claiming that his work on the Sabbath, his healing, his restoring, his making broken things whole, is the same type of work that God performs, the divine sustaining work that never stops. And John makes absolutely sure you don't miss the point. The very next verse in that chapter says, "For this reason they tried all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was also calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God." There it is, stated explicitly by the Gospel writer himself. The Sabbath healings were not just acts of compassion. They were not just demonstrations of power. They were theological declarations, spoken in the language of action rather than words. Every time Jesus healed on the Sabbath, he was saying, in the most public and undeniable way possible, "I have the same authority over this day that God does, because my Father and I are doing the same work." And if that's true, then the rules, the categories, the fence, the entire system built to protect the Sabbath, all of it becomes secondary to the person standing in the room. Because if the Lord of the Sabbath is here, then the Sabbath answers to him. And the confrontation didn't slow down. It accelerated. The man born blind in John chapter 9. This healing is a masterclass in deliberate escalation. Jesus doesn't just speak a word. He bends down, spits on the ground, mixes the spit with dirt to make mud, and physically smears it on the man's eyes. Then he tells the man to go wash in the pool of Siloam on the southern end of Jerusalem. Now, making mud on the Sabbath was itself a violation. Kneading was one of the 39 categories. Applying a poultice to a wound was considered medical treatment, which was forbidden for non-emergency conditions. Jesus wasn't just healing. He was going out of his way to perform multiple technical violations in a single act. It's as if he wanted to stack the charges. The man washes in the pool. He comes back seeing. For the first time in his entire life, he sees the faces of people in the streets of Jerusalem. Colors, light, the temple walls, his own hands. And the Pharisees are so destabilized that they launch a full investigation. They interrogate the man. They interrogate his parents. His parents, terrified of being expelled from the synagogue, refuse to give a straight answer and say, "Ask him. He is of age." The Pharisees bring the man back a second time and demand he give glory to God, because we know this man is a sinner. And the formerly blind man gives one of the most iconic responses in the entire Bible. Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. They throw him out of the synagogue. But listen to what the Pharisees say among themselves in John 9, verse 16. "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others among them say, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" And they are divided. That division is the earthquake beneath the whole story. Because the Pharisees understood something that gets lost on modern readers. In their theology, genuine miracles could only come from God. If these healings were real, and nobody denied them, not even Jesus' worst enemies ever denied the miracles themselves, then the power behind them had to come from somewhere. Either from God, which meant God himself endorsed the Sabbath breaking and everything it implied, or from Satan, which was the accusation some of them eventually reached for. But the accusation never quite held because the healings were too good, too complete, too unmistakably restorative. A man blind from birth now sees. A woman bent for 18 years now stands. A paralytic of 38 years now walks. A withered hand opens and flexes in a synagogue in Galilee. These weren't ambiguous magic tricks. These were the exact signs the Hebrew prophets said the Messiah would bring. Isaiah chapter 35, written 7 centuries before Jesus in the courts of ancient Israel, describes the Messianic age in vivid detail. "Then will the eyes of the blind be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer and the mute tongue shout for joy." Jesus was performing exactly those signs, and he was performing them on exactly the day that would force every witness to confront the one question the religious establishment did not want to face. Who is this man? Who has the authority to overrule the Sabbath? And if the answer is only God, then what does that make the rabbi from Nazareth? And if you go back to the very beginning of Jesus' public ministry in the fishing village of Capernaum, you find that this pattern was there from the opening scene, woven into his mission from day one. Mark chapter 1. Jesus enters the synagogue in Capernaum on the Sabbath and begins to teach. The people are amazed because he teaches with authority, not like the scribes who always cited previous rabbis as sources. And then, right there in the middle of the service, a man with an unclean spirit cries out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." The demon identifies Jesus before any human being in that synagogue can, and Jesus rebukes the spirit with a single command: "Be quiet. Come out of him." The spirit convulses the man and comes out with a shriek. The entire synagogue in Capernaum is stunned. They turn to each other and say, "What is this? A new teaching, and with authority. He even gives orders to impure spirits, and they obey him." This is the first recorded miracle in Mark's Gospel, and it happens on the Sabbath, in a synagogue, in front of everyone. On the day of rest, Jesus does the most restless thing imaginable. He enters a war with darkness and wins it with a sentence. That same afternoon, after leaving the synagogue, Jesus walks to the home of Simon Peter and Andrew, near the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Peter's mother-in-law is lying in bed with a severe fever. Luke's account says people specifically asked Jesus to help her. And Jesus goes to her bedside, takes her by the hand, and lifts her up. The fever leaves immediately, and she gets up and begins serving dinner. The Pharisees aren't present in Peter's house for this one. There's no public confrontation, but the timing tells you everything. It's still the Sabbath, and what does the healed woman do? She serves, she prepares food, she hosts. In other words, she does exactly the kind of domestic work that Sabbath law restricted. And Jesus doesn't stop her. He lets the healing flow into action, into life, into generosity. And by that evening, after the sun goes down over the Sea of Galilee and the Sabbath officially ends, Mark says the whole town of Capernaum has gathered at Peter's door. People bring everyone who is sick or demon-possessed. And Jesus heals many of them. But here's what's worth noticing. The townspeople waited until sundown. They knew the rules. They respected the Sabbath boundary. They brought their sick after the Sabbath ended, which means the healings that happened during the Sabbath, the ones Jesus initiated without being asked, were deliberate choices, not accidents of timing. 7 healings across 4 Gospels. And when you lay them side by side, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Every single Sabbath healing was visible, public, and confrontational. He healed in synagogues in Galilee, at a Pharisee's dinner table, at the pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem, in Peter's home in Capernaum. He made sure people saw. He made sure the authorities knew. He made sure the question was unavoidable. This wasn't a rabbi who happened to break a rule on an inconvenient day. This was a man on a mission, and the Sabbath was the stage he chose for the most dangerous statement of his life. While the confrontations were escalating in synagogues and temple courts and dining rooms across Galilee and Judea, something larger was building in the political landscape that almost nobody talks about. The Pharisees weren't operating in a vacuum. Rome was always watching from the Antonia fortress that overlooked the temple courtyard. The province of Judea was one of the most volatile territories in the empire, a pressure cooker of religious fervor, political resentment, and messianic expectation. False messiahs had risen before, and every single time Rome had responded with devastating, disproportionate force. Crucifixions lined the Roman roads, villages burned, populations were scattered or enslaved. The Pharisees lived with that reality every day. They knew that if a popular rabbi started making divine claims, drawing massive crowds to the shores of the Sea of Galilee, challenging established religious authority, and creating public disturbances in every synagogue from Capernaum to Jerusalem, it was only a matter of time before the legions took notice. And when Rome took notice, it wasn't just the troublemaker who paid the price. It was the whole city, the whole nation. This is why the high priest Caiaphas later says in John chapter 11, one of the most tragically prophetic statements in the entire Bible, "You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish." He was speaking politically. He was speaking from genuine fear, and his fear was not irrational. Within 40 years of Jesus' crucifixion, in 70 AD, Rome did exactly what the Pharisees had dreaded. The legions under General Titus surrounded Jerusalem, starved the city, breached the walls, burned the temple to the ground, and killed or enslaved hundreds of thousands of Jewish people. The temple has never been rebuilt. The Western Wall in modern Jerusalem is all that remains. So when the Pharisees watched Jesus heal on the Sabbath and felt their blood run cold, it wasn't petty legalism, it wasn't small-minded religious snobbery, it was existential dread dressed in theological clothing. This man was threatening the fragile, precarious life-or-death peace that had kept the nation alive under Roman occupation. In their eyes, he was playing with fire that could consume everything they'd fought to protect. But this is exactly what makes the Sabbath healings so staggering. Because Jesus knew all of this, he grew up in this world. He understood the politics, the fear, the history of national catastrophe tied to covenant violation. He knew what the Pharisees were afraid of, and he knew they weren't entirely wrong to be afraid. And he chose the Sabbath anyway. He could have healed on a Tuesday. Any Tuesday. Every one of those people with chronic conditions had already waited years. The woman bent over for 18 years in that synagogue had already endured 6,570 sunrises. The man at the pool of Bethesda had been lying there for nearly 4 decades. Medically, theologically, practically, one more day would not have mattered. But Jesus didn't wait. And the reason he didn't wait is the whole point of the gospel. If Jesus had stopped after 1 or 2 Sabbath healings, this would be a very different story. Just a rabbi with a different interpretation of the law, a liberal voice pushing back against conservative tradition. An argument between scholars that might have faded into history like 1,000 other rabbinical debates. But he kept going, because he wasn't arguing about interpretation. He was making a claim about identity, and that claim had consequences no one could walk back. Mark chapter 3, verse 6. After the healing of the man with the withered hand, the Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians. Those two groups normally despised each other. The Pharisees were religious purists. The Herodians were political collaborators who supported Rome's puppet kings. They agreed on almost nothing. But they found common ground in one shared conviction. Jesus of Nazareth had to be stopped. John chapter 5, verse 18. After the pool of Bethesda, the leaders tried all the more to kill him, and John spells out the double charge, breaking the Sabbath and making himself equal with God. 2 crimes, 1 act. Because by healing on the Sabbath, Jesus was claiming to do what only God could do, on the day that only God could overrule. Every miracle on the Sabbath was a claim of deity wrapped in an act of mercy. And the religious leaders in Jerusalem and Galilee understood that perfectly, better probably than anyone reading the Gospels 2,000 years later. They heard the claim. They saw the evidence. They recognized the messianic signs from Isaiah, and they chose to protect the system over following the truth. Some did break rank. Nicodemus, a Pharisee and member of the ruling Sanhedrin, came to Jesus under cover of darkness and said, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the signs you are doing if God were not with him. He came at night because he was afraid, but he came." Joseph of Arimathea, another council member, eventually gave his own personal tomb carved out of rock for Jesus' burial after the crucifixion. The cracks in the system were there, but the system held. The very devotion that made the Pharisees respected leaders, their zealous commitment to the Torah, was the same thing that blinded them. The fence they built to protect God's law became the wall that blocked them from seeing the God that the law was pointing to. Now, if you've been following this story and you've been paying attention to the pattern across all 7 healings, There's something building underneath it that reaches across 20 centuries and touches something very personal. Because this isn't just ancient history, this is about you. Jesus was making a claim about what the Sabbath was always supposed to be. When God rested on the seventh day in the creation account in the book of Genesis, it wasn't because he was tired. The Hebrew word is shavat, and it means he ceased. He stopped, not from exhaustion, but from completion. The work was done. Everything that had been formless and void was now ordered and beautiful and alive. And the rest that followed was the crown of creation, the moment when everything was whole. The Sabbath was a celebration of completeness. But over the centuries, something happened. The celebration became a burden. The gift became a test. The rest became restless. Layer after layer of interpretation was added, each one well-intentioned, each one a little heavier, until the people the Sabbath was meant to bless could barely breathe under the weight of keeping it. Jesus said it plainly in Mark chapter 2. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That single sentence upends the entire religious system of first-century Judea. The Sabbath exists to serve people. People don't exist to serve the Sabbath. And if a daughter of Abraham has been bound for 18 years in a synagogue in Galilee, then the Sabbath, the day of rest, the day of wholeness, the day that celebrates the completion of God's work, is exactly the right day to set her free. Because that's what the day was always about. And this is where the invitation reaches beyond the ancient world and into your life right now. Because the pattern the Pharisees fell into is not ancient history. It's happening right now in churches and faith communities and in the private spiritual lives of people all over the world. How many people have experienced religion primarily as a system of rules designed to fence them in rather than set them free? How many people have walked into a place of worship carrying a burden they've held for years and been met not with healing but with regulation? How many people have been told, in one way or another, come back on a different day, your problem doesn't fit our schedule? The woman bent over for 18 years in that Galilean synagogue is not just a character in an ancient text. She's your neighbor who stopped going to church because someone told her she wasn't welcome. She's the teenager who asked an honest question about faith and was told to stop asking. She's the man sitting in the back pew every Sunday, carrying a wound he's never told anyone about, wondering if God sees him. She might be you, carrying something for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to stand up straight. And Jesus looks at every single one of those situations and says the same thing he said in that synagogue 2,000 years ago. You are set free. He doesn't wait for the right day. He doesn't check with the gatekeepers. He doesn't ask the system for permission. He walks into their territory on their holiest day, in front of their faces, and heals the people they had decided could wait. And they killed him for it. The same religious authorities who were supposed to shepherd the people of God conspired to eliminate the God who showed up to shepherd them himself, not because they didn't understand what he was claiming, because they understood exactly what he was claiming, and accepting it would have meant dismantling everything they'd spent their lives building. It's the oldest human story there is. Choose the system or choose the person standing in front of you. The Pharisees chose the system. The healed chose Jesus. And 2,000 years later, that same choice stands in front of every person who encounters this story. You can protect the fence. You can defend the categories. You can insist that healing wait until the proper day, on the proper terms, through the proper channels. Or you can do what the woman in that synagogue did. You can let someone who sees you, really sees you, place his hands on the thing that's been holding you down, and hear the words that change everything. Stand up, you're free. The real question isn't why Jesus healed on the Sabbath. It's what you do when the God you thought you understood shows up and refuses to play by the rules you built for him. If this gave you something to think about, subscribe. We go deep into stories like this every week, connecting ancient texts to the questions that keep you up at night. And if you want to understand why Jesus said, "I and the Father are one," and how that single statement turned the entire religious world upside down, that video is on screen right now.